We're going to talk this morning, I'm going to talk about a man who probably was living in a bit of a storm. In fact, he'd probably been in a storm for most of his life. Well, at least for as long as he had been ill. Because I want you to imagine for a moment what it would be like to live with a condition that in its day was called a living parable of sin. Can you imagine living with a condition that had that label pasted over the top? And what that would have been like to live under that judgment and condemnation and the fear that it created in other people when they saw you. Can you imagine that? The shame, the judgment that comes with it. Never, never welcome anywhere. Always the outsider. No friends. Apart from maybe amongst those that were suffering from the same thing. Always the cold shoulder. Thank you. Imagine then, when that condition is a genuine sickness, nothing to do with sin, nothing to do with wrongdoing, nothing to do with anything other than sickness that anybody could have caught. And then, of course, you've got the illness itself and its smell and its associations, the pain. There are probably some diseases today that carry a similar sort of stigma, I expect. But I'm talking about leprosy, of course, which in its day was probably one of the most feared diseases. And it took you out of your family and you became an outcast. These days, leprosy is treatable. It's a bacteria that is very similar to tuberculosis. It could be treated with antibiotics. But not then. Not then. And it was called a living parable of sin. So the whole thing must have felt inescapable. Inescapable. So I'm going to look at a story that is, I've chosen the one from Mark, but in fact it's also in Matthew and Luke. But I've chosen the story from Mark for a particular reason, and I'll explain that in a minute. So I'm going to read from Mark chapter 1, verses 40 to 45. And I'm probably going to take issue with the translation, at least of one of the words that will appear on the screen in that version of the NIV, because you will notice that this version of the NIV has a different word. A man with leprosy came to Jesus and begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus was, according to that, filled with compassion. Jesus was indignant, according to this one. He reached out his hand and he touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. "See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere. This is early on in Jesus' ministry. And yet already he's beginning to discover what it is to be sought after and kind of chased out of the towns in a way. Matthew starts, we read his gospel version, Jesus came down from the mountain. Mark doesn't tell us that. It's probably quite important in terms of context because he'd just given the Sermon on the Mount. And if you think about the Sermon on the Mount, it's full of don't judge, be filled with love, respond rightly. Well, that's my paraphrase, but you know what I mean. Give to the poor, love your enemies. Don't inspect the log in your own eye when you can see a splinter in. Don't inspect the splinter in somebody else's eye when you've got a log in your own. And now here's a leper. How is Jesus going to respond to this man? Mark is the gospel that gives us more than any other gospel an insight into the emotional reactions of Jesus. We don't see the emotional reactions of Jesus very often, do we? But Mark gives us an insight. And to think that Jesus was indignant, that's not a very comfortable thing, is it? But we'll look at the story. So a man with leprosy comes to Jesus. He would have had a bell. He would have had to have notified people that he was on his way. And the shouts of unclean would probably have got to Jesus even before the man did. And you can imagine if he came from the back of the crowd, that actually people would have been clearing the way, wouldn't they? They would have been moving backwards, getting out of the way, so that there was no danger that they would come into contact with this man. You can almost imagine the angry rumblings of the crowd, because this man should not even be here. He's unclean. He should not come into public gatherings, breaking the law. But he dropped on his knees in front of Jesus. And he says, if you are willing, you can make me clean. If you are willing. I'll come back to that in a sec. Jesus was indignant. Was he cross with the man with leprosy? Was he cross with this outcast, this infectious, contaminating, probably smelly man coming out of where he lives through the crowd, risking everybody else's health? Is he indignant with him? No, I don't think so. This is the difference between Mark and the other Gospels. Is he cross because he thinks he's going to be at risk of catching it? No, I don't think so. Indignant has its place in this story because it is the displaying of anger at something that is unjust, at something that is not right. And I think it's Jesus' reaction to the injustice of this man's treatment, of this man's exclusion, of the living parable of sin label that's been put above him, the stigma that's attached to him, at his loss of dignity, at his loss of family. He can't go to the temple, he can't worship with others in the synagogue. He's expressing a kind of a righteous indignation at the situation that this man finds himself in through no fault of his own. And the leper comes to Jesus and says, if you are willing, you can make me clean. If you are willing. Do you ever do that? Do you ever give somebody a get out in your question? I'd love to meet you for coffee, but you're probably so busy that actually you haven't got time to do that. And so I'm going to give you the get out in my question, because I'd rather give you a get out that you can say no to, and then I haven't got to go away thinking, doesn't like me, doesn't want to meet me, I'm not good enough. You know, have you ever done that? Maybe not in that kind of context, but you've done it in some way or another. You've given someone a get out. I'm probably not, I'd love to apply that for that voluntary thing in the church, but I'm probably not the right person. I'm probably not the person you're looking for. I'm probably not quite good enough at whatever it is. Actually, we do it more than we realise, I suspect. Because we can't stand rejection, can we? Rejection is just too painful. And this man has lived, however long he's had leprosy, has lived that rejection. And so before Jesus can reject him, he says, basically, you're probably not going to be willing. But I know you can. And Jesus responds. Jesus says, I'm willing, but that was his second response. Did you notice his first one? He touched him. That was his first response. He touched him. Who would have expected that? He touched him. I wonder if it was fingertip. No. If you look at the word touched, it actually means he took hold of. He adhered to. It was a deliberate and forceful touch. I wonder if he laid his hand on his kind of chest, shoulder area, touched him. Can you imagine the shock of the crowd? How long was it since this man had been touched in this way, physically touched in this way? And a touch that probably conveyed to that man acceptance, lack of judgment, compassion. Somebody who didn't care for the law. That he was seen and noticed. Him, not the disease, him. And I wonder if his healing began in that moment that he was touched and known and loved, even before Jesus said the words, I am willing. And Jesus says, be clean. It's the word that is always associated with healing of lepers, cleansing. And it's a command, really. Be clean. Be clean. And it's a word that actually means literally clean, ceremonially clean, spiritually clean. So it's not just a cleansing of the disease, it's a cleansing of all the judgment that's come upon the man through that disease, the stigma, the condemnation, all the stuff that goes with being an outcast, cleansed. And straight away, it was so. The man was clean. The rabbis taught, at that time, that the cleansing of a leper was akin to raising the dead. That's how unlikely healing of a leper was. It was like raising the dead. And of course, this man probably felt like he was the walking dead. So restricted was his life. And here he is, restored to life. We could go on and look at the other emotion Jesus displayed. A bit of anger, really. Don't go telling anyone. Just please don't tell anyone. But of course, the man, how could he not, healed of such a thing, not tell anyone? The word spread. But what I want to say to you today is we do not need to come to Jesus with any get-out clause. We do not need to come to him and say, you probably don't want to do this, but actually, could you? I know I'm not really worthy enough, but could you? I'm probably not good enough, but could you? I probably haven't got enough faith, but could you? I don't know how you start your prayers. Jesus showed that this man, with all that he carried, didn't have to put up an obstacle to the answering of prayer. Jesus welcomed him, touched him, then healed him. So I'm going to invite you to allow him to touch you today. What do you need him to do in your life today? And if there's that little niggle, but you probably won't want to touch me today, Lord, I probably wasn't holy enough yesterday, I wasn't good enough, I didn't do this and I didn't do that. Just flick those away, those words, and just focus on Jesus, who welcomed this man, welcomes you, loves you enough that he would die for you, and wasn't afraid of being contaminated. Amen.